Well, it's so nice to see everybody. Thank you for making the time. This is our second CERTL offering in this series, and it is one of the sessions that counts toward the associate level certificate. You'll see at the end that I have a QR code that will take you to a form where you can fill that out and explain, and we can tabulate that towards your efforts in this space. My name is Erin Hager. For those I haven't met before, I work in our Faculty Center for Teaching and Learning around professional development, and I run our graduate teaching assistant program with my colleague Eric. And Jen O'Miller is here. She is also one of the CERTL leads, and we are excited to continue with this. So today we're going to be talking about assessment, and that's a big topic. So we're going to do that from a really high bird's eye view. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Let's see. Is everyone seeing the main slide? Okay, excellent. So today, like I said, we're going to be talking about kind of some foundational principles in assessment. Assessment is a big topic in higher education, particularly in the context that you find yourself in a health and human services professions campus, because assessment really goes all the way up through our accreditation practices. So this is definitely something that, as a future faculty member, will be a big part of the ethos in the environment in which you find yourself. And we're going to talk about a lot of terms today, but we're going to focus particularly on this concept of alignment with our learning objectives and the strategies for building grading rubrics. Any questions about where we're headed with that? Okay. So for those who were able to engage with the session last time, we talked a lot about learning objectives, and we had a mnemonic device, this ABCD method for crafting learning objectives. To recap, learning objectives are those statements that help us as educators articulate what the finish line is for students, what we want them to be able to do as a result of the learning. And I'm just curious, does anyone remember any parts of that ABCD mnemonic when we're thinking about that technique of crafting learning objectives? Doesn't have to be in order. Do you remember anyone want to call out any of those letters?
Audience.
The audience. Yep. So we're talking about who the learners are. Anyone remember the B for behavior? I'll just pull it up here so we can call that back pretty quickly. So these statements can follow this format where we're describing who our learner is. So by the end of this lesson, students will be able to, right? The learner will be able to. And then we describe a behavior, whether they will be able to compare, whether they will be able to analyze, whether they'll be able to craft something new. And then some of these optional ones down here, the condition, right? Like if we're giving them some context around that performance, whether they're going to be able to do it in 30 seconds or, in a particular moment of time in their curriculum. And then D is degree, the extent to which they are performing at a particular level. And the reason I wanted to take a moment to call this back is because when we're thinking about our assessments, a foundational principle we have to have in place is where we wanted the students to go in the first place, right? And those are our learning objectives. We can't measure whether they've gotten there if we aren't clear about what that finish line is. And that's the main thing that we're going to be talking about today, this concept of alignment. So here are some examples of learning objectives, and they ground us in what I hope we're able to do by the end of our time. So I hope that by the end of this session, we will be able to loosely define some commonly used terms in assessment. A lot of these terms could be hour-long workshops in and of themselves, but we're just going to kind of get you oriented into the landscape of this terminology. We're going to brainstorm properly aligned assessments, given some examples, and then we're going to talk about grading rubrics and how to think about crafting those. But before we do any of that, I'm curious about your experience as a learner and in the disciplines that you're in now. And I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind taking a minute just to share what assessment strategies are most common in your discipline or most effective in your opinion? And also, what interesting strategies have you encountered as a student? Did you ever have an assessment method or some kind of interesting project in a course that you've taken that you remember?
I can give some reflection. So I think in my experience, the most common form of assessment, typically quizzes, tests, multiple choice answers. Although I think what I've experienced as being the most effective, at least as a former instructor, is those assignments or those assessments that allow the individual to have more creative
Ah,
autonomy over them, so that they kind of get more of a critical assessment of what they're doing, as opposed to kind of just cut and paste what's the answer, memorizing, allowing them that kind of higher level of thinking.
yeah, yeah. And your nameplate at the bottom just has a first initial
Oh,
last name. What's your name?
I'm Brianna. Sorry, I don't know how to.
Brianna. Thank you. And what's your field? What discipline are you in?
I'm in the School of Medicine. I do vaccine research.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And so in those, what I'm assuming would be more traditional hard sciences, you noticed a lot of quizzing and testing. But as an instructor, you said you've had, so what have been some of those more creative assignments that you've had experience with?
So I've in the past, when I've taught like labs, we'll have opportunities for the individuals to kind of give their own input on the lab, like what would you change kind of questions, or
Oh,
like what didn't go right this time and how can we prevent it from going further, as opposed to telling them exactly like this is the result you want, and if you don't get this, it's wrong, you
yes.
know.
Oh, I love, I just watched a session on this concept of growth mindset, right? This idea that we can learn from our mistakes and we're constantly growing. And that opportunity just to identify what went wrong and normalize it, right? Like this happens in the lab all the time, but what can you get out of it? What would you do differently? I love that. Thanks for sharing, Brianna. That's what assessment strategies do you notice as being common in your fields? Yeah, Aman.
Uh, um, so I remember like I was in that class and I also was TA for that class, fortunately, during my master's. So the assessment was something related to like data. So whatever was taught in the class, so the instructor made sure that we happen to practice the same thing, like in the form of exercise, and that was very much helpful, I think. So that provided a hands-on experience beside like just sitting and looking in the class, doing it by self, and that helped me a lot to understand and do the data analysis. As of now, like I can do all of like regression and even the modelings and all those things. So I think
Yeah,
for me as a student that helped a lot, and as a TA also when I was involved, so assessing those questions and also taking some extra classes for them helped me a lot. So I think
yeah,
revision, yeah, exercises based on revision are one of the best tactics. And
yeah.
definitely like there are quizzes and all those things as Bianca, I don't remember her name, but as she mentioned, those are also good tactics to do.
Yeah. And did I hear you say exercises based on revision?
Uh, Exercise based on, yeah, whatever we learned in the class, the instructor
Yes.
made sure that we have hands-on practice with those data sets.
Yes. So very applied opportunity to work with the information, right? In a practical way. That's great. Any other thoughts about assessment strategies that you think are common in your field or interesting?
Something that I think I experienced a little bit as a graduate student, and when I've taught graduate level courses, I use very little of like the recall or the base level of blooms. I do a lot of asking questions that are design a hypothesis and test it. If this was your hypothesis, how would you design an experiment?
Mhm.
So it almost, especially now when a lot of exams are take home or classes are remote, and we know that they have all of the information in front of them. It's just testing how students are thinking and getting
Yeah.
them to think and engage with the material as opposed to memorize it.
Yeah. That's such an important point. I think the context of where our students are, just in terms of the access to information that they have now, right, really has the opportunity to help us question, to what extent do we really need to be spending our assessment energy, right, at some of these earlier levels. And in some cases, maybe you do, right? You need to make sure that everyone's on the same page before they advance. But recognizing that in the fields they're going to go working in, they'll be able to access concrete information pretty quickly. It's a matter of processing it and applying it, and using it for those higher order thinking.
I will say that last semester I taught a non-majors bio class and I tried to do a little of that and it was a complete disaster. So it
Right, so-
definitely is like level dependent.
Yes, context matters, right? And your outcomes are probably different for each population too, right? Yeah. Well, this is such a good discussion. Thank you guys for sharing this. Let me just mute there. Okay. All right. So what I would like to do now is, at a very high level bird's eye view, just talk about some of the terminology that we see often in the assessment space. As I mentioned, each one of these could be a workshop in and of itself, but I just kind of want to ground us in some of these terms. So the first set of terms is this difference between assessment, grading, and evaluation. And some folks use them interchangeably, but I think as you'll see as we go through that, we really can think about them as three separate things. And for each one of these, I've provided a link to a website that has more information about this concept, and I'm going to give everyone the PowerPoint at the end so you can go through and follow those. But when we talk about assessment, we're really talking about any kind of information, any data that is designed to help us improve learning. Right, so it's really a measure of what learning has taken place at this moment in time. This could be individual. This could be looking at a whole group and deciding how is the class doing with this particular concept, whether it's graded or not. The assessment that we're doing is giving us as instructors information about how the students are doing. And then if we use that good feedback, it's also giving students information about how they are progressing. Now, grading is typically a score or a letter that culturally we have come to understand has meaning collectively, right? It's considered a proxy for learning, right? So if someone has an A in Bio 101, culturally we kind of assume that to mean mastery of a particular set of skills, but it's not always a direct measure of that learning, right? It's a proxy. Sometimes people assign a grade using components of their grading schema that may or may not have anything to do with learning. So the example I always give when I talk about this is when my kids were in elementary school, they could get extra credit for bringing in boxes of Kleenex to help the teacher out during cold and flu season, right? So that's going into their grade, but is that measuring anything about whether they can do fractions? No, right? So things can go into a grade, even things like attendance, right? We assume if students come, they're learning, but that's not direct measure of their learning, right? They're sitting in class, right? So anytime we're adding elements to our grading schema that aren't direct measures of learning, then that proxy becomes a little bit more distant and potentially problematic. But we do assign grades. It's part of our ecosystem that's part of the ocean we swim in as educators. But I do want to just make that distinction, right? And then finally, evaluation is a much more broad, holistic picture, and it's an evaluative judgment of where a student is at a particular moment of time. So we think of evaluation, something that we might see at the end of a particular course of study. It's using multiple pieces of data to make a judgment about where a student is on their journey. So if we are looking at a health profession student and we declare them, quote, ready to practice, right? That is an evaluation that's based on test scores for sure, but also clinical experiences, also observations, simulated patients. There can be a lot of things that go into that designation of being ready to practice, right? Also the word competent, right? That's something that you see a lot, particularly in fields like we have represented here at UMB. If you're on a doctoral journey, right, and you're declared ready for candidacy, or you're a PhD candidate, right, that is taking a holistic look at all of the coursework you've done, your proposal, all of the research that you are have done and are considering, and it's looking at all of that collectively and saying, yes, the student is ready to begin that independent research. Right. So those are evaluations. It's a much bigger, broader, holistic. And with evaluations, we're evaluating the student, and with assessments, we're assessing learning. Right. So kind of different focal areas. Any questions about those differences? No. Okay. So the next grouping of terms that I want to share with you is this idea of formative versus summative assessment, right? Formative assessment are those kind of activities and experiences that we do to measure learning as a means of information, right? We're doing maybe a low stakes quiz. We're doing a classroom activity where we're just trying to get a sense of, are the students getting these concepts? How are they coming along in this journey? It's information for them to measure their own progress, and it's information for us to see whether or not we as educators need to change our approach, need to cover something a little more in depth, or if we're all ready to move on. All right, so it's assessment data for information that we can then use to revamp our strategies, either our strategies as educators, or it could be information for the students to say, oh, I need to brush up on this a little bit more at home. Summative is more of what's leading us toward that grade or part of that broader evaluation data. So a summative assessment might be your final exam, your observation of a simulated patient, right? Something where you are hoping that they have taken what they have learned and they're producing something that's giving you a measure of where they are at this moment that you are using to mark progress or not, or to factor into that evaluation. So sometimes you hear formative as being assessment for learning and summative as being assessment of learning, right? At the end of a learning sequence or cycle. Are there any questions about those two concepts? And either one of those can be graded or not, right? That just depends on your preferences as an educator. The next thing that I want to talk about, we touched on a little bit with Brianna's comment, is this idea of authentic assessment. And these are assessment strategies that are designed to give the students the experience of how the information that they're learning is used in the real world, right? So in Brianna's example with unpacking why a lab experiment might have gone wrong, right? You can see a professional bench scientist looking at data and figuring out that their experiment didn't go as planned, and going through that deconstructive process of figuring out what went wrong, right? You can see a course on, say, healthcare policy, having students look at and compare the health policy from city A to city B, right? And make recommendations based on that. So it's asking them to perform tasks that look like what professionals in that field would do. Obviously, it's not going to be exactly the same, but it's giving them a little flavor of how using that information in the real world would look, right? So that's the idea behind authentic assessments. And then finally, the last thing I want to put on your radar is there is some interesting conversation now in the assessment space that has to do with the power dynamic that is inherent in a grading evaluative relationship between an instructor and a student. And there's some rethinking around that. And so there are these terms that you'll hear, for example, contract-based grading. So contract-based grading is a system where a faculty member will say, okay, if you are choosing as a student to get an A in my class, these are the benchmarks. And the benchmarks might be you can't miss more than 2 classes. You have to earn at least exceeds expectations on 4 out of 5 of these particular kinds of assignments. You can't not turn in any assignments. You must turn in everything to get an A, right? But if you are choosing that this is, if you're saying to yourself, this course is not my highest priority this semester, I'm fine with a B. These are similar kinds of hurdles that I need to do to earn a B, and they're slightly reduced. So what it's doing is it's putting the power back in the student's hands and saying, instead of me as an instructor determining whether your work is good enough, right? And to some extent, the instructor, of course, will be doing that. But if the student is making a conscious decision that their goal for this course is a B and they're fine with that, then it's being very transparent at the beginning of what's involved to meet those expectations. Right, labor-based grading is similar, but it has a lot more to do with the student tracking their hours and tracking their effort and reflecting on what they are seeing as far as their own performance, their own growth as a learner based on that effort. So it's sort of turning the, as I mentioned, the power dynamic on its head and inviting the student to be more involved in articulating what that growth and development looks like for them, obviously with the input and the feedback from the instructor informing that. So as you enter the academic space and you start hearing some of these words, I just wanted to give you a bird's eye view of the landscape of some of these concepts around assessment. Any questions of these? I know there's probably a million questions, but just as an entry point, how are we doing? Yeah,
So,
Audrey.
I have a question. So obviously, there are a lot of assessments that we have in the classroom, I think now, and that's different from how teaching used to be. Do you have like an opinion or an approach to how we can get students comfortable with different types of an assessment so that it's not just constantly this anxious or fear or, like this adverse kind of, response to all of these assessments?
Yeah, what a wonderful question. It really demonstrates, Audra, your student-centeredness and your approach to education. What does the rest of the group think? How can you get students comfortable with new kinds of assessment strategies?
I found that when kind of touching on the very last point we discussed, that when their grade is more based on the effort and not necessarily the right and wrong, or when they kind of have more autonomy over the grade as opposed to just like this binary, like true false type assessment, is more of like an assessment of their thinking process and maybe more of their engagement with the material, that I've gotten a little less anxiety for my students. So as opposed to like maybe doing like an end of year exam, they have more like an end of year presentation on a topic of their choice. And it still assesses their understanding of the material, but just in a less like scary way, I guess. So maybe that could be one tries, or one way is to take away like the binary, like the right wrong component, or make it less of a grade of like do you memorize it, and more of like them being able to engage with the material. That might help.
Yeah, that's a great approach. I think too, being really transparent with the students about, recognizing that might be a new assessment method they haven't seen before. And so, kind of presenting it in stages so that rather than having it be kind of a high stakes opportunity where they're working with this new kind of assessment, maybe you've introduced it in a very low stakes way, you've practiced it, you've normalized the discomfort around it, that kind of thing. And then as they get experience with the method itself, then you can kind of start raising the stakes a little bit. I always found in my teaching experience, like just taking a minute to explain why I'm doing something, or why I'm trying this out, why I think this would be beneficial. It makes it feel less arbitrary. Even if it still is uncomfortable, at least they know I've put some thought into it, and I'm open to their feedback. But I have a hunch, Audra, that just by thinking of that question, that you would take the steps necessary to help minimize students' discomfort with a new approach. And then sometimes rationalizing it, into their future growth and development. Say, I know this is a little bit more challenging assessment, but when you are working as a XYZ type of career professional, you're going to encounter this in the workplace, and I want you to feel prepared and ready, right? So that's the kind of rationalization or explanation, so that they know it's done with their own growth in mind. It's such a good question. Great. I think a related concept to Audra's question also is this idea of alignment, right? I think students feel anxious when the way that they are thinking about the information, the way that they've been presented with what they think the expectations are, doesn't line up with how they are interpreting that assessment. So one thing that we can do that's and to be really mindful of that student anxiety is to make sure that what we say we want the students to accomplish is also what we're measuring, right, at that time when we're ready to measure it. And that's the big concept of alignment, making sure that our learning objectives match up with the activities we're doing in class to practice, and that those match up with the assessments that we're given. Not that they're carbon copies of each other, but that the style and type and task that we're asking of the students stays consistent with what we said that we were expecting from them to start with, and drawing the connection between that alignment and going back to those learning objectives as you're teaching can go a long way to doing that. So I thought we would just look at some examples because I always work better with concrete examples. This can sound pretty fuzzy. So here's an example of an objective and an assessment that are not aligned. So the objective is to identify the countries, capitals, and major waterways and mountain ranges of Chile and Argentina, right? So you can picture this being a entry-level geography course, let's say. And then the assessment is to, in a short essay, explain how these geographical features have affected the economies and foreign relations of these two countries. So who can tell me at what point the alignment went awry? What do you notice about these?
The purpose of the question was not to assess the economy or foreign relationship, but to assess about like the waterways and mountain ranges. So that was different in the assessment.
Yeah. What would you expect an assessment to look like if the objective were this one, identify the country's capitals, et cetera? What would be an example of an assessment that is aligned?
Having them fill in a map of
Mhm.
the country.
Yep. Exactly right. Here's a map without things named. You go ahead and put the names in. You come into my office. I ask you where things are. You point on my map, that kind of thing. Exactly right. So now later on, it may be that they're going to explore the concepts that they need to do that assessment, but that objective is at a much earlier level in that learning journey, right, than what the assessment is. Can you guys see that disconnect? Okay. So here's a second example, and this one I would say is aligned. So this is in a course for health and wellness coaches, and they're looking at sort of the state of their field as it relates to credentialing. So the objective is to critique the state of affairs for credentialing and licensure, right, of these coaches. And then I'll give you a second to read that prompt. What kinds of things do you see in the phrasing of that prompt that let you know that it is aligned to the objective?
Well, the objective was to critique, and the assessment asked for the individual to take a side in the debate. So that kind of prompts the individual to have to give their own kind of perspective on the side of that question.
Mm-hmm. Right. The critique is like a natural byproduct of that taking a stand, right? Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Right. So if I were a student and this were my assessment and I knew that objective, I would feel like I could fill that circle, right? I understand how those things are related. In the first example with the waterways and the map, I would feel a little bit bait and switched as a student, right? If I had studied and I knew where the mountains were and then I got in there and needed to answer that exam, I would feel like the way that I prepared and what I was being assessed didn't match, and I would, that would cause a lot of anxiety and frustration. So making sure we have that alignment is really important. So I thought we would just brainstorm, right? Using some examples. These are objectives created by students in our graduate teaching assistant program. And so I wonder if we could just brainstorm a couple of ideas for each one about what might be an assessment that could align with this objective. So the first one is from a physical therapy student. List at least 3 cognitive screening tools suitable for an occupational therapist to administer in this particular setting. So what might be a way we could assess this?
And I'm not
Yeah,
very well
Brianna.
versed in this area, but the first thought that came to mind was maybe like a case study type question where you give symptoms or like a example of a particular case, and then kind of ask or have the person think through what they would do in that particular situation.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that is certainly a good type of assessment, but I wonder where on the continuum that case study approach might fall. If here they're just at a level of just kind of listing out what the tools in the toolbox are at this point. You see where I'm going with that question? Yeah.
I would
I
say
think,
that the
yeah,
physical,
Simone.
so the physical testing, but I'd say
Yeah, so
yes.
this would be, for example, and I know this is kind of tricky when this is in our field, but this might be a course where the students are just getting the lay of the land of what kinds of assessments are out there, right? That would test a cognitive would be a cognitive screening tool. Yeah,
There
Aman.
are a lot of tools to test that. If I remember, there is one called modified mini mental state test. There's 3MS test. We can take some standardized tests as well to assess any such case, I think. So 3MS
Yeah.
is one of the popular tool to assess cognitive abilities.
Yeah. And even if we don't know what those particular tools are, we could imagine a test question that says, list 3 out of
Yeah.
the 5, cognitive screening tools, right? I mean, I think sometimes where we get tripped up is that very often the assessment itself is baked right into the objective, right? If we're asking them to list things, really the assessment could be as simple as that, right? Just here are the 3 or 5. Here are 3 out of the 5 that I know exist. Maybe if we were going to assess at a higher level, maybe the objective could be describe them, right? Describe when you might use something like that or what it's appropriate for, that kind of thing. So we could advance the level of the objective a touch. But the assessment can really be very similar to what that objective is to start with, right? And then to Brianna's point, as the learning journey continues, then they might get to a point where they're able to look at case studies and evaluate maybe which one I would use here and which one I would use there. All right, let's try one more. So this is a course on weight-based oppression and stigma surrounding weight. And it's from a student in a social work program. This is her PhD focus. And so her learning objective is to have students distinguish between these 3 concepts. So what might be an example of an assessment that would help a faculty member see whether or not students can distinguish between these 3 things?
Maybe some question related to uh, body shaming, or maybe related to like some kind of like weight-based stereotype kind of question to assess. Here can work, I think.
Yeah. I think, going back to that idea of case studies, maybe presenting 3 vignettes, right? Little short stories, just a few sentences each that describe, person A, you give a little paragraph and you say, is this an example of A, B, or C? right? And then you can
Mhm.
repeat it so that you can see if students can make that distinction, right? So or which of these three is an example of this, right? That kind of thing. All right. Again, I know it's tricky when this isn't our field, but sometimes it's helpful to see something a little bit outside of our discipline to practice with some of these things. All right. So I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure we leave enough for this idea of rubrics. And I want to tell a little story about how I came to appreciate this tool called Rubric. And my teaching background is in Spanish language. And there was one semester where I taught 3 sections of Spanish, conversational Spanish. So it was focused on speaking and natural production of language. And I taught 3 sections right back to back. So Tuesday to Thursday, basically from 9 until 2, I was constantly in this world of Spanish conversation class. And at the end of the semester, we had oral presentations. That was a big component of their grade. And students would get up and they would have prepared a 10-minute talk on a topic of their choice. And I gave them a few guidelines. You know, I said, bring in a visual aid to help you and you know, it can be on anything you want. And, you know, just show me your language production skills, you know, in the context of this presentation. So you can imagine, it's the end of the semester, it was hot. There, I would have 3 to 4 students present every class. So by the end of that 3rd class, I would look back on the notes that I had taken for these different presentations, and they were so spotty. I found that I was, you know, making evaluative comments and making evaluative, you know, grading based on, you know, how interesting the presentation was to me, right? Is this the 3rd time I've heard about Shakira's influence in South America? Or, you know, did you pick a topic that just happened to catch my interest that day? I also noticed that students had spent way too much time and effort on their visual aid, when for me it was just a little something extra for the presentation, but I could tell that these guys had spent hours, like fancy posters, and PowerPoint had just come out, so they were like doing all these whiz bang things in PowerPoint. I'm like, no, this isn't the point. Where, you know, the point really was, how's the grammar, how is the fluency, all those kinds of things. But I didn't communicate any of that well enough. And so I realized that I was really doing the students a disservice, right? Like I was creating this this evaluation at the end, this grade of a pretty high stakes assignment based on all kinds of things that had nothing to do with their language production and their language skills. And so I was talking to a colleague and she said, oh, it would be so helpful if you had a rubric for this. And that was a pretty new concept in higher education at the time. I think now K-12 students are very, very used to having rubrics for their assignments. So by the time they get to higher ed, this is something they've been used to, but it wasn't as common at the time. So given that story and given that very like concrete need for this tool that I had as an instructor, I like to take a second to really talk about like what are rubrics and how can we think about creating them. So as you've probably experienced both as a student and an educator, rubrics are really just a set of criteria for student work that includes descriptions of different levels of performance based on the criteria that you're going to evaluate, right? And so they help students have a framework for the feedback that they're going to get on assignments that are complex and subjective. And this is really key. Not every assignment that we give needs a rubric associated with it, right? But for those higher stakes, higher point assignments that involve a lot of what could be perceived as judgment on our part, evaluative judgment, rubrics can be helpful both to communicate those expectations to students ahead of time, but also keep us grounded in what we're looking for as we're listening to our 15th presentation of the day. Right. And so they help establish expectations. They help focus students' effort. I think if I'd had a rubric, those students would not have spent 5 hours on their PowerPoint, right? And they might have reviewed their verb tenses a little bit more. And they help make those grading efforts more consistent. So the example that I like to give with this, it might seem silly given the fields that we're all representing, but I like to use it, this idea of a chocolate chip cookie rubric, because we all know what a chocolate chip cookie is, right? We all have a picture in our head. When I say, please, I want everyone in this class to bake me chocolate chip cookies, we all have a picture of what we think that might mean. But there's a lot of variation, and there's a lot of variation in preferences when it comes to someone's ideal chocolate chip cookie, right? So when we start thinking about, if I'm an instructor and I'm giving this assignment, right, what exactly am I looking for in my chocolate chip cookie, right? So one of the things I might start to break out is like, okay, one of the things I want to talk about is the texture, right? What's the crunchiness to chewiness, right, that I'm particularly looking for, right? The level of chocolatiness, right? And how does it look, right, when it comes out of the oven? Right. And the reason I like this example is because in academia, we can talk about similar sounding assignments, right? When I say I want you to write a reflection, well, the reflection I'm looking for in my course might be very different than the kind of reflection that someone that they're taking the very next class with is looking for. When we talk about lab reports, right? Maybe that looks different in a biology class as compared to a psychology experiment, right? So we think we know what these words mean and they have kind of a common vision around them. But when we have specific things we're looking for, either because of our field or because just that's the point of this course or what I'm looking for as an educator, we need to break those things down and be really transparent with the students. Any questions about this? Okay, so when we're creating these rubrics and we've got these criteria, okay, these are the 3 things that I'm looking for in my cookie. And now I need to think about what excellent looks like for each of those. So then we just start kind of filling in that rubric based on, usually it's easiest to start with what excellent looks like and then kind of work your way down from there. So taking a minute to describe what that truly excellent texture looks like and using terms that are as concrete as possible while recognizing that we'll never be able to describe every possible way this could look. We're just trying to give the students some guidelines about what this can look like. So here I've said on at least 75% of the batch, the baker has created a crispy exterior and a chewy interior. Cookies are baked evenly all the way through, right? And then you'll notice that for each level down, I've kept the same basics of that description and just changed it slightly to show that leveling down, right? Some people might find it easier to start with the ones that need improvement and then work your way up to describing what truly excellent looks like for that. Any questions about these? Has anyone written a rubric before?
Partly.
Yeah. You've written one, Aman?
Partly. So
Partly. Uh-huh.
yeah.
And did you find it, what did you find interesting about that experience or challenging?
I think we need to be very careful with choosing the correct word, like for the instruction. Like sometimes it can be very much confusing to the
Yeah.
students. So that was something I validated again and again.
Yeah.
I was a teaching assistant, so I did that.
Yeah. They are challenging to write. It forces us to think in really concrete terms about what we want. And we run the risk of using vague language, which can be confusing for the students. But also we can run the risk of being so specific that we're actually giving them, a recipe to follow, as opposed to letting them go through that struggle of figuring out their own process. So it's for sure a balancing act. It's not easy. And I think your point, Aman, about doing it several times, is really important, right? Looking at past
Yeah.
student work can help you. Yeah.
No, in one of the classes, what the instructor used to do was, like during the first week, like first class, there used to be a poll, and based on that poll, like what is the current knowledge of the student, how much they know, like it was data decision making class, so how much they are comfortable with using the terms like statistical terms like mean, median, or how can they do t-test or correlation or something like that. So the professor used to assess in the beginning of the class, and we used to make modification in the syllabus and even in the rubrics based on
Mhm.
that. And in addition to that, I think if the students are international students, so in the class, we should be very much careful, more careful about the language, like choice of language.
Yeah. Yep. Yes. Sometimes even having, oh, Audrey, yeah, please.
Oh, so I taught a master's level class last fall, and the students had throughout the semester a three-part project that like built on each other, and I thought that I was doing well at like improving my rubrics, but at their final presentation, I invited other instructors from the department to come, and they used my final rubric, and they also graded the students, and it was at that point that I realized how vague my rubric actually was.
Mm,
When I saw their, their grading and their comments on the rubric, a lot of that actually reflected back on how vague my instructions to the students were, not necessarily how the students were performing.
yeah. Did you feel, Audrey, in that instance that you and your students had a shared understanding of what those terms meant, and the difference was that those additional evaluators?
Um, I I think there was there was a lot of learning at all levels going on.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that. That is another function of a rubric, right? Is to when you're broadening your evaluation team, right? To include people outside of the context of the class. And you're right that what do they call it? Inter-rater reliability, right? Can come into play. And rubrics, I think, are one of those examples of things that as young educators, as early educators, that you modify over time, and rethink, as your assignment evolves, as your conceptions of what it is you're looking for evolve. Right? It certainly isn't something that we get perfect right out of the gate, for sure. All right. So just to recap those steps of creating it and recognizing that this is an iterative process, as we've heard from Audra and Aman. One important first step is, again, to go back to those learning objectives and really ground yourself. What is it that you're looking for in this assignment, right? How does this assignment tell you that the students have crossed a particular finish line in your course? And then thinking about what those levels of performance look like, and how you're going to weight them comparatively, right? Like there might be something, again, with my example of the visual aid, that was really only about 10% of what I was looking for out of the whole presentation. And the other categories on the rubric were going to be weighted more heavily, based on the objectives and the focus of the class. And then describing those levels of performance, and trying to echo that descriptive language as much as possible between those levels of performance. And then really taking the time to get some feedback for yourself on that rubric before you deploy it, if possible, right? So to Audra's experience, maybe if there had been time, and that's always the that's always the sticky wicket in education. There never seems to be enough time for anything, but if there had been time to say, hey, this is the rubric I'm thinking about using to evaluate their presentation, what do you think of this? Right? That might be an opportunity for other folks in the field. And sometimes even getting feedback from the students can be useful too. What do you think is important in this kind of assignment? Giving them an opportunity to control it 100%, but to provide some input on what they see as valuable. Any thoughts about that? No? Okay. Well, I think we've covered some of these tips in the last slide, but again, using prior student work to inform the rubric, particularly that muddy middle area, having colleagues look it over, also remembering that there's no way to take the subjectivity out of an assignment like this. Often, we can be as specific as we want in a rubric, but at the end of the day, we are still making some evaluative judgments on that, and just recognizing that. And then again, as to Audra's point, adjust as needed based on experience and feedback. We heard that from Aman as well. So thank you so much. Are there any questions or key takeaways that have come up for you as a result of this session today?
Yeah, talking about the subjective, right? But and that is some bias that we bring into that. So that's our bias.
Yes. Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up, Saman. The question of bias in assessments is a really important one. And it can come through even in what we consider more objective assignments too, right? There can be bias in the way that we phrase a multiple choice question, even though it has one correct answer, in addition to there being bias in the way that we evaluate an oral presentation at the end of a semester. So that is a topic in and of itself that's really
Exactly.
worthy. If that's interesting, for you, we can talk about
Yeah.
finding someone to come and speak to that.
Actually, it's bias how we understand the world around us, and that is that's our experience, right? So and how you understand and you make your category. So
Yeah,
to understand,
exactly.
and I'm sure with conscience or consciousness, you put it in everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The bias and the emphasis on equity is a big component for that movement that I talked about earlier around the ungrading or the labor-based grading. Those efforts really took root in the assessment of writing, and some faculty members there who have been leading this movement, one of their main motivators is that they think that in doing and taking the emphasis off this evaluative grading aspect, right, and putting the student in the driver's seat on helping to evaluate their own growth and progress, that it changes the dynamic in a way that they are hoping is a more equitable approach to evaluation and assessment. That's one of the key drivers of that movement. I'm so glad you raised that. Thank you. Any other questions or takeaways from today? There's so much to this. If there are any topics that that you think would be a natural follow-up to this, or resources that you are curious about on any of the things that we've raised, please reach out and we will try to either make that session happen or put you in contact with some of those resources or folks who might be able to explore this a little more deeply. All right.
Okay,
Well,
awesome.
I am going to, the next slide here is a QR code. If you guys have your phones, if you want to do that, we've implemented a new form in Certle. And I think Jen sent this out through the listserv, but as a way of keeping track of different sessions and things that people are doing to earn their certifications, we have this form that you can fill out each time you do something in the Certle space. Or toward that certification. And so it has a few questions about what the event was, a couple of questions just about your feedback on it, right? How you think it was, and then some key takeaways. So you can fill that out now or at a later time. And that will help us keep track of where folks are in the certification process. And then the last thing that I want to do is just to put in the chat this presentation. Let's see if I have to
Quick question.
stop sharing.
Was today's session called Assessments and Rubrics or Foundations of Assessment and Rubrics, just for the?
Oh, either one. Yeah,
Okay.
I think my slide might have been different than what's on the website, but we'll know which one that is.
And this is
you.
UMB programming,
Yes.
not, okay.
Correct. Yep. So you can get Certle programming from the National Certle Organization. You can take programming from other institutions, and we just want to keep track, kind of the sense of where folks are finding the things that are meeting their needs.
And one last theoretical question. If we missed the last one last month, the January 20th one, I see here there's an option that says, how did you engage with the programming? And asynchronous is an option. If we went back and did engage with that, would we still be able to get credit for attending?
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yep. We have the recordings on our website. And let's see here. So I'm trying to find this. Here we go. Okay. So I'm putting this PowerPoint in the chat. Except that it still thinks I'm using it. Let's try that again. Okay. So you will have the file in the chat. We will put this recording up on the website for you to review if you want, but also to you know, for other folks to do exactly that, Brianna. They can watch it and record it there. Thank you so much for your participation today. It's great to see you. We're so excited about this CERTL initiative on campus and really glad you're a part of it.